Hello, my name is Esther from Kenya, Esther Nyakiti. My partner's name is Neema Baraka from Tanzania, and we are from Group 10. And our topic was: should African universities prioritize bioinformatics training over wet lab genomics due to cost and scalability? And we were on the negative team. On to my first slide, which is the introduction part, is that genomics is a revolutionizing a field in very many areas of sciences such as healthcare, agriculture, biological sciences on a global scale. And African universities often encounter significant challenges such as limited funding, infrastructural deficiencies, and a shortage of skilled personnel to work on the genomics data, especially on the lab setup. However, this discussion explores the question of whether African universities should focus on the bioinformatics training rather than wet lab genomics, considering the potential benefit in terms of cost and scalability. So in our presentation, we add that despite these significant opportunities presented by bioinformatics that favors it over wet lab, it can result to a strategic mistake in the African continent and putting it as a risk to our scientific independence, data sovereignty, and long-term development of our capacity in Africa. So our opening statement is that our position is clear. African universities should not put greater emphasis on bioinformatics training at the expense of wet lab genomics. So this is due to wet lab and bioinformatics both serve as complementary fields rather than being interchangeable. So one cannot survive better than the other. So substituting wet lab genomics with bioinformatics restricts a lot that I had mentioned earlier, such as local data generation, weakens our ethical and policy controls of our own data, and poses a threat to keeping African institutions in a prolonged scientific dependency on relying on other people's data. So it also leads to sustainable, and in order to attain a sustainable and locally relevant genomics research, it requires an integration and investment in both wet lab and computational biology training. So, on to our constructive argument. One is that bioinformatics depends on wet lab genomics. How so? Bioinformatics can only analyze data, but however, it cannot generate it. Wet lab is the one that is primarily responsible for the genomic data generation. So without wet lab data, we cannot rely on bioinformatics on its own. So African universities often rely on the external data sets obtained from other parts of the world and continents, which should not be the case. However, in our case study, we find that many African institutions analyze genomic data generated from Europe and North America, and also use their databases whenever they want to refer to something in genomics. This limits our local control and authorship, you see, because if it is like finding for a protein structure, we rely on proteins that others have already put in their database. What about if we use the proteins from our own data that we have generated? And has been proven time and again from our cited source, Genomic Research Data Generation, Analysis and Sharing. So into our constructive argument number 2 is that wet lab genomics ensures scientific sovereignty, that is scientific independence and the sort. How is so? Because it enables the local control of our sample collection and processing with our own rules and regulations. It also strengthens our ethical review of how we view the data that we have, and also the data governance that we have control over it fully. It also protects the intellectual property rights associated with the scientific community, and also the authorship of different things that we can be able to know. For example, the case study of export of African biological samples has led to the loss of ownership of our own data and decision-making power, in that a study in South Africa showed that participants often question the ownership of the rights of what their data has been used for, and also the favor of the benefits that can be encountered when using their data. We also have local relevance, which requires local data as our constructive argument number three, which African has high genetic diversity from across the continent, Northern Africa, Eastern, Southern, and Western, and we face a variety of unique diseases and agricultural challenges, which we have to generate our own local data set in order to make a conclusion out of them, other than relying on other data sets. An example is malaria, tuberculosis, and diabetes, which often require local sequencing of the local genes to often have the required public health interventions. We also have a constructive argument number four, which is integrated training builds better scientists. An integration of both wet lab and bioinformatics will improve on data interpretation. It supports experimental design skills and also produces African researchers who are independent thinkers, not just relying on other things, but we can also think on our own and generate our own data. A case study is whereby researchers trained in both wet lab and bioinformatics, mostly in the universities, often lead to stronger and grant-winning projects compared to ones who focus on one side and overshadowing the other one. Our constructive argument number five is that wet lab genomics drives innovations and jobs. This has created employment for people such as lab scientists, research scientists who are located in the lab, and also lab technicians. And in this, so it supports biotechnology and diagnostics, which require wet lab technologies in order to make a conclusion out of them. Hence, it strengthens the national research and also ecosystems surrounding it. Hence, universities should incorporate both wet lab, as it creates more employment compared to computational biology. A case study is that countries in Africa investing in genomics lab often develop stronger biotech innovation hubs links to universities, such as the case of South African universities, which focus more on integration of both uh, the wet lab and the bioinformatics. So on to the rebuttal parts, they say that claim one, ethical allocation of public resources, whereby bioinformatics is cheaper and therefore a more ethical use of limited public funds. However, we rebut by saying that ethical allocation must consider how the long-term effects of what we want to achieve than the short-term cost. We might be saving today, but at what cost? It might cost us our freedom and our sovereignty. Hence, wet lab genomics is the foundational infrastructure for data generation, and excluding it puts a risk to our scientific dependency. Claim number two was that data sovereignty and governance, which the affirmative claim that prioritizing bioinformatics strengthens Africa data sovereignty. We rebut it by saying that sovereignty begins with the local data generation. Once we generate our own data, not analysis alone. Analysis alone does not guarantee you that you are going to patent it or it belongs to you. You are using other people's data. Hence, without wet labs, Africa controls the interpretation of the data, but not the biological production, which leads to the end-to-end sovereignty, which requires sample collection, sequencing, and analysis within Africa. So claim number three, they say that employability and industry readiness, whereby they say that bioinformatics graduates are more employable and industry ready, which we rebutted by saying bioinformatics only trains risk producing narrow skill sets. These are just predictions most of the time. However, wet lab genomics supports a lot, and it covers a lot in terms of employability in the biotechnology, diagnostics, agriculture, and also public health industries. So it covers a wide variety of the economy of the different African countries. Claim number four was that resilience to under-resourced conditions, which also might be true, which they say that bioinformatics is more resilient in low resource setting. Yes, however, we rebut by saying that resource constraint justifies smarter investment, but it does not justify that we need to abandon the wet labs. Regional hubs and shared facilities increase wet lab sustainability. We can come together as an African continent and put our resources together to fund also the wet lab that will supplement the bioinformatics, and also coming up with our own data set and data tools. So over-reliance on bioinformatics creates a vulnerability in case at one point we face problems that will require us to patent these other people's products. Also, they say that portability and continuity, whereby bioinformatics training is more portable and reproducible. However, portability without local data generation limits research independence. Hence, wet lab genomics will enhance the collaboration with local scientists and the realities. They also claim that adaptabilities to evolving science, whereby they say that bioinformatics is more feature-proof and adaptable, but to say that wet lab genomics also evolve and enable validation of discoveries. The sequencing technologies that were used before are not the current ones being used up to date. So we also keep on developing them. So the closing statement will be that African universities ought not to make a decision between bioinformatics and wet labs. However, they should just supplement the two and require and use them together. So the advancements of genomics in Africa will depend on the balanced and integrated approach of both the wet lab and the bioinformatics. Thank you.